I'm Scott Lucas. This is today's EAWorldView on Egypt. Why the regime is more concerned about the Sinai Peninsula than about mass protest. Last weekend in Egypt, there was the repeat of a now familiar ritual. Thousands of people came out on the streets to protest against the military-backed interim government in Cairo and in other cities. They were met at certain places by security forces and by those who supported the interim government. Clashes ensued. Almost 50 people died. This is becoming quite a familiar routine, that every few weeks the marches begin, sometimes getting to where they want to go, sometimes being stopped, but dozens of people, sometimes many dozens of people, die. The bigger question, will it unsettle the Egyptian government? No, not really. Beyond the headlines that occur in the 24 hours after the marches, the fact is that in the subsequent weeks, almost no shift is made politically, and that is for these reasons. First, the movement really has no clear defined goal. Back in 2011, when the Mubarak regime was overthrown, people could talk about democracy coming to Egypt. They could talk about a new way, replacing more than 3 decades of authoritarian rule. Now the choice has been defined for many Egyptians as you either accept the military-backed government or you accept the Islamist of the Muslim Brotherhood. Perhaps that is an unfair polarization, but the fact is that no one is putting forth a third way. No one's talking about a civil society movement, one which spans secular and religious, so-called right and left, and can claim to represent all Egyptians. And so when forced to choose, a lot of Egyptians will either say, well, we back our government, or they sit on their hands. Second, the political protests have no clear leader. Most of the Muslim Brotherhood's senior leadership is now behind bars. They will stay there for many months, perhaps years. The regime has also put pressure on other groups, limiting their ability to publish, their ability to communicate. Those restrictions, too, will continue. Non-governmental organizations face pressure on their finances. In other words, the government crackdown, in part, is limiting the ability of Egyptians to find that third way. But no one is actually countering that. You can't just simply blame this on government repression. In 2011, groups stepped forward and said, we need a different way. Where are they now? And that leads me to my bigger point. This interim government, let's be more specific, the armed forces behind this interim government are not primarily concerned about the armed protest now. Instead, they're concerned about another threat, the threat in the Sinai Peninsula. Since the July 3rd coup, Islamist groups in the Sinai, that space of land between the Suez Canal and the border with the Gaza Strip, have increased their attacks. They have killed dozens of Egyptian security forces. They pose a possible threat to pipelines carrying oil across the region. They could, in theory, pose a threat to shipping through the Suez Canal, though they haven't attacked yet. The government was concerned enough that last month it sent in military forces, a big military force, to attack the Islamist bases. They killed at least 20 Islamists in the first wave. They have killed more subsequently. They have hit from the ground. They have hit from the air. They have carried out mass detentions, raids on houses. But still the attacks continue. Earlier this week, 6 more Egyptian soldiers died in an attack. So what happens if the government can't quickly put down this threat? What happens if the Sinai continues to be unstable? Well, then it becomes a threat not only to Egypt, but to others as well. Israel, for example, sees the Sinai as a very valuable buffer zone, which effectively can only be remilitarized with its permission. But now it faces a choice. If the violence continues, it either allows the Egyptian military to bring more and more forces in, or it faces an Islamist threat on its doorstep. Behind Israel, other Arab countries will look with concern at the possibility of a flare-up in which so-called radicals or extremists are challenging yet another government. And yes, the United States, which continues to pour billions in military aid into Egypt, will also be worried. And this is not just a military threat in the Sinai, it's an economic threat. There are key tourist resorts in the area, for example at Sharm el-Sheikh. So far, most of the violence has occurred in the northern Sinai. If it moves towards the southern Sinai and those areas of tourism, then Egypt faces a major hit to its economy, an economy that is already reeling with loss of foreign reserves, declining production, instability amongst many industries. That economic threat is almost as great as the military one in the long term to Egyptian leadership. The fact of the matter is that for all the headlines that protests have gotten in Egypt since January 2011, this is not a Tahrir Square moment. This is not a people's revolution that will occur. The government will stay in place, so will the armed forces. And the threat, the real story, is what's happening not in the public squares in Cairo, but what's happening in the villages and in the open spaces in the Sinai. I'm Scott Lucas. This has been today's EA Worldview on Egypt.